I, Chloe, 27, lie recovering from a ruptured appendix while my mother adjusts her silk wrap in the television's reflection. I'm here now, Chloe, so you can stop the dramatics, she says, her voice cutting through the heavy smell of industrial bleach and lukewarm chicken soup. Serena smirks from the doorway and two nurses freeze mid-shift, witnessing the clinical coldness of her arrival. I do not cry or blink. I simply maintain an absolute, freezing silence that drains the air from the room. Perform for someone else. How the manila envelope hidden in my sheets dismantled her world is the story I need to tell. Growing up in the sprawling colonial on Oak Street, the architecture of our home was a physical manifestation of my mother's internal hierarchy. Eleanor curated every room like a museum exhibit, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the unspoken rules of her favor. At the dinner table, a polished mahogany surface that sat 12 takar, the seating chart was never accidental. Serena, with her golden curls and practiced laugh, always occupied the seat to Eleanor's right, basking in the direct glow of her approval. I was positioned at the far end, near the swinging door to the kitchen, a tactical placement that ensured I was within reach for service, but outside the frame of her social radiance. My presence was a footnote, a necessary but uninspired detail in the family portrait she projected to the world. I learned to navigate the house like a ghost, avoiding the creaky floorboards and the sharp edges of my mother's clinical gaze. Eleanor's logic was never rooted in cruelty, but in a cold, commercial efficiency that prioritized the most visible asset. To her, Serena was a blue-chip stock, a vibrant reflection of her own vanity that required constant nurturing and high-end investments like the $400 tennis lessons and custom-tailored gala dresses. I was the diversified low-risk bond, self-sufficient and therefore unworthy of her attention. She justified this neglect as a form of respect for my independence, telling neighbors that I was the strong one, who didn't need the hand-holding Serena required. In reality, she was simply bored by my lack of drama and my refusal to perform for her validation. While Serena's trophies lined the mantel, my achievements, like the full scholarship to the Design Institute, were acknowledged with a brief, distracted nod before she returned to planning Serena's 16th birthday party. What I didn't understand then was that my mother's total lack of interest was the very thing that allowed me to build a life she couldn't touch. In the periphery of this sterile environment stood Grandma Rose, a woman who smelled of rural Iowa soil and the faint, sweet scent of cinnamon rolls. She visited twice a year, appearing like a quiet disruption in my mother's carefully manicured world. While Eleanor bustled about, criticizing the caterers or adjusting the lighting for a dinner party, Rose sat in the kitchen's breakfast nook, nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee and watching. She was the only person in that house who looked at me without looking through me, her sharp blue eyes cataloging every dismissed accomplishment and every silent withdrawal I made from the family dynamic. She never challenged Eleanor openly. She was too wise for that kind of direct confrontation. Instead, she would press a worn $5 bill into my palm with a firm, knowing squeeze that felt like a secret code. At the time, I thought she was just being kind, but today I know she was performing a much deeper audit. Rose wasn't just visiting. She was gathering the evidence that would eventually dismantle my mother's leverage. August 14th, 2016 was a Tuesday, characterized by a stagnant humidity that even the industrial-grade air conditioning in our Oak Street home couldn't fully suppress. The living room was staged for a celebration, heavy with the cloying scent of white lilies and the chemical sharpness of fresh furniture polish Eleanor insisted upon before guests arrived. I stood by the window, watching a singular wasp struggle against the glass, while Eleanor sat at the mahogany desk, her Mont Blanc pen poised over a ledger that dictated our respective futures. She had just received 2 envelopes, Serena's acceptance into a 6-week Parisian arts intensive, and my confirmation for a senior internship at a premier design firm in Manhattan. The air between us felt thin, vibrating with the silent tally of costs Eleanor was already calculating. She didn't look up as she adjusted her watch, a Cartier tank that caught the afternoon light with a blinding, clinical precision. I waited for the recognition of my merit, but she only saw a budget conflict. Serena requires the cultural immersion that only Paris can provide at this pivotal stage in her development, Eleanor remarked, her voice as flat and final as a gavel strike. She closed the ledger with a soft, decisive thud and looked at me, her eyes devoid of malice, filled instead with the terrifying clarity of a merchant. The $12,450 in the education account is a finite resource. Chloe, you have always been remarkably self-sufficient, and I'm certain you'll secure another opportunity. I watched the condensation on her glass of Sancerre, a single droplet tracing a path through the frost, as Serena leaned against the doorframe, her smile a quiet, predatory victory. Serena's new leather luggage set sat in the hallway, already tagged for Charles de Gaulle, a physical manifestation of the theft disguised as pragmatism. I didn't argue or present the spreadsheets showing my internship was the superior long-term investment. I simply noted the exact angle of Eleanor's dismissive tilt. I left Oak Street 3 days later, the silver handle of my bruised Samsonite suitcase vibrating in my hand as I walked toward the bus station. I carried exactly $412 in cash and a resentment that had finally crystallized into a cold, unbreakable structural support. The city of Chicago greeted me with a gray, indifferent skyline and the smell of wet asphalt, a stark contrast to the sandalwood-scented prison I had escaped. I found a sublet in a building where the radiator hissed like a wounded animal, and the linoleum floor was scarred by decades of transient lives. My first dinner was a lukewarm cup of noodles eaten on a crate, the silence of the room more nourishing than any meal Eleanor had ever provided. I had no furniture, no safety net, and no family, but as I looked at my reflection in the dark window, I saw someone Eleanor could no longer reach. The decision was made. I was starting at zero, finally free. By November 2018, my reality had narrowed to the fluorescent hum of a sublet office on Wacker Drive and the rhythmic clicking of a Logitech MX Master 2S. I was earning $18.50 an hour at a boutique firm called Symmetry Graphics, a place that smelled of stale breakroom popcorn and the chemical ozone of a high-speed Xerox Altalink. My workspace was a 60-inch slab of IKEA laminate, positioned exactly 3 feet from a drafty window that overlooked the gray, churning waters of the Chicago River. At 11:42 p.m., the city would go quiet, leaving only the sound of my keyboard and the distant, metallic screech of the L train. I worked 80-hour weeks, my eyes tracing the Bezier curves of logos for mid-sized pharmaceutical companies, while my back stiffened against a chair that lacked lumbar support. I didn't call Oak Street. I didn't ask for a bridge loan when my radiator failed in mid-January, leaving my breath visible in the kitchen at 4 a.m. I simply adjusted my scarf and kept clicking. The winter of 2019 was a clinical study in endurance, punctuated by a bout of influenza that left me shivering under 3 layers of thrift store wool. On February 12th, my checking account balance sat at $42.16, a figure I stared at on my cracked iPhone screen with the detached curiosity of a lab technician. I had missed 4 days of work, and the rent for my 400-square-foot studio was due in 72 hours. While I boiled tap water to make a thin broth of bouillon cubes and saltines, I watched Eleanor's digital footprint, a series of high-resolution captures from a private villa in St. Bart's. She looked radiant in a $2,000 Eris swimsuit, her smile a polished performance of effortless wealth. She had posted a caption about the importance of surrounding oneself with excellence, oblivious to the fact that her eldest daughter was currently calculating how many days a single loaf of bread could be stretched. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, structural clarity. The intervention arrived on March 4, 2019, in the form of a plain white envelope postmarked from Davenport, Iowa. Inside was a handwritten note from Grandma Rose, her script a series of sharp, disciplined loops that reminded me of barbed wire and cedar fences. She didn't offer platitudes or hollow sympathy. She included a cashier's check for $8,200 and a single sentence that acted as a psychological tectonic shift. A craft is a weapon only if the tools are sharp. Chloe, consider this an investment in the armory. I didn't spend a cent on rent or food. Instead, I walked into the Apple store on Michigan Avenue at 10:15 a.m. and purchased a fully spec'd iMac Pro and a Wacom Cintiq Pro 24, tools that allowed me to compete at a tier Eleanor couldn't even define. Rose understood that money wasn't for comfort. It was for leverage. She was providing the capital for a silent insurgency, ensuring I was no longer a ghost, but a hidden architect. By 2022, I had transitioned to a senior role at Nexus Collective, a high-stakes branding agency where the air was filtered and the clients spoke in the hushed tones of old money. My salary had climbed to $145,000, a number that allowed me to move into a concrete and glass loft in the West Loop, where the morning sun hit my desk at exactly 7:14 a.m. I was the lead designer for the Ether Initiative, a global rebranding project for a conglomerate of luxury wellness retreats that specialized in curated isolation. I spent months perfecting a visual language of muted sage greens and brushed gold, a palette designed to signal exclusivity and moral superiority to the world's elite. I moved through the industry as a shadow, my name buried deep within the metadata of files that would eventually dictate the aesthetic of a multi-billion-dollar market. I was no longer the girl at the service table, I was the one deciding what the table looked like. The irony began to crystallize in the spring of 2024, though Eleanor remained blissfully unaware of the gears turning beneath her feet. Her favorite sanctuary, the Serene Waters Wellness Retreat in Lake Geneva, became the flagship property for the Ether initiative I had spent 18 months designing. During my research phase, I discovered that Eleanor had invested $650,000 of her inheritance into the retreat's parent company, effectively becoming a minority stakeholder in the brand I was building. Every time she checked into her suite, she was surrounded by my typography, my color theory, and my strategic vision for luxury. She sat in the lounge, sipping herbal tea from ceramics I had commissioned, praising the intuitive elegance of the environment to her social circle. She was paying my agency, and by extension me, to provide the very backdrop for her vanity. She was funding her own obsolescence, handing over her capital to the daughter she had dismissed as a low-risk bond. As I sat in the sterile silence of the hospital 3 years later, watching the surgical drain pulse with a rhythmic, mechanical indifference, I reflected on the calls I had made to Lake Geneva. Eleanor's refusal to answer on that first day wasn't a surprise. She was too busy living within the brand identity I had meticulously constructed for her. When she finally arrived on the 4th day, smelling of lavender and the crisp air of a retreat she didn't know I owned intellectually, she saw a daughter who was supposed to be broken. What I didn't know then, as I watched her adjust her silk wrap in the television's reflection, was that Rose's manila envelope contained the final piece of the structural collapse. The trust wasn't just money. It was the deed to the very leverage Eleanor thought she held over me. She had come to perform a scene of maternal charity, but the stage was mine, the script was written, and the audience had already left the building. The 12th of October, 2025, was a Saturday defined by a precise, biting chill that the outdoor heaters at the Oak Street estate struggled to mitigate. Eleanor's 55th birthday gala was an exercise in performative elegance, smelling of imported white truffles, aged bourbon, and the ozone-heavy scent of the high-end fog machines she had rented for the occasion. I stood by the stone balustrade, watching the 200 guests move like schools of expensive fish through the ballroom, their laughter a choreographed symphony of social validation. The lighting was a soft, calculated amber, hitting the baccarat crystal at angles that felt almost aggressive in their brilliance. I wore a charcoal gray suit from Theory that cost $1,800, the fabric stiff enough to hide the slight tremor in my hands, and the surgical adhesive still clinging to my side. I had come not for the celebration, but to witness the final structural integrity of the facade I had spent my life supporting with my silence. My recovery from the appendectomy had been a clinical study in solitary resilience, a period of 14 days where my only consistent interactions were with the rhythmic hum of the IV pump and the distant, metallic clatter of the hospital carts. At 7:14 p.m., as the first course of lobster bisque was served, I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows and noticed how the fluorescent-induced pallor of my skin was now masked by a $300 foundation. I moved through the room with the measured pace of a woman who had recently learned the exact value of her own breath, avoiding the sharp corners of the conversation. I hadn't spoken to Eleanor since the day she sent the text telling me to check with the nursing staff, yet here I was, standing in her shadow, observing the way she manipulated the air around her. She looked radiant in a custom emerald gown, her movements fluid and devoid of the weight that usually accompanies a guilty conscience. Serena was holding court near the grand piano, her laughter a high, artificial frequency that cut through the low hum of the crowd like a serrated blade. She was regaling a group of venture capitalists with stories from the Lake Geneva retreat, describing the transformative silence of the Serene Waters wellness property as if she had discovered a new religion. She didn't acknowledge my presence until I was exactly 4 feet away, her eyes flicking over my suit with a predatory assessment of its price tag before settling into a look of practiced pity. "It's so good you could make it, Chloe. Though Mother was worried your little health scare would be another reason for you to stay isolated in that concrete loft of yours," she remarked, her voice dripping with the sweetness of a rotting peach. I didn't correct her on the definition of a ruptured organ or the 3 times I had reached out to her while she was in a mud bath. The dinner service commenced at 8:42 p.m., a meticulously timed event where the seating arrangement once again placed me at the tertiary table near the ventilation intake. Eleanor rose for her toast, the candlelight dancing in her diamonds with a clinical, cold precision that matched the tone of her voice. She spoke of legacy, of the importance of investing in vibrant futures and the aesthetic of excellence that defined our family brand. She gestured toward the room's branding, the very visual identity I had designed for the Ether initiative, praising the anonymous genius behind the retreat's success while her eyes never once met mine at the back of the room. It was a masterpiece of exclusion, a public declaration that my contributions were only valuable when they were stripped of my name. What I didn't know then was that my silence was no longer a shield. It was a fuse that had already been lit. The trigger arrived during the second course, a dish of seared scallops that smelled of sea salt and the expensive butter Eleanor preferred. A family friend, a woman named Beverly who had known us since childhood, leaned over and asked Eleanor about my recent absence from the social circuit. Eleanor didn't miss a beat, her smile remaining perfectly intact as she sipped her 2004 Krug. Hatsa Chloe has always had a flair for the dramatic when things aren't revolving around her, Eleanor said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding tables could hear her judgment. She claimed a medical emergency right as we were entering our silent meditation phase in Lake Geneva. It was quite a distraction for Serena, who really needed that time to decompress from her startup pressures. The table erupted in a collective murmur of sympathetic nods, a silent agreement that my near-fatal infection was merely a tactical play for attention. I watched the way the light refracted through my water glass, noting the 3 distinct ice cubes melting into a singular, transparent mass. The clinical detachment I had cultivated for years began to vibrate with a new, structural tension that I could feel in the base of my skull. It wasn't the insult itself that broke the balance. It was the realization that Eleanor's logic was perfectly consistent and entirely impenetrable. In her world, my ruptured appendix was a failure of my character, an inconvenient biological protest against her curated schedule. She believed her own narrative with such ferocity that the truth had become a foreign language she refused to learn. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the stitches in my side pull with every shallow breath I took. The silence that had once protected me from her volatility was now a suffocating weight, a vacuum that was pulling the oxygen from the room. The final line was crossed when Eleanor announced the next chapter of the family's financial legacy, a moment she had timed for maximum impact between the main course and dessert. She stood again, her posture regal, and announced that she was liquidating the $250,000 stability fund that had been established by my late father for my first property. After seeing Serena's incredible drive with her lifestyle brand, I've decided that capital is better utilized as an immediate seed investment for her expansion into the European market, Eleanor declared, her eyes shining with a sense of righteous pragmatism. Chloe, as we all know, is remarkably self-sufficient and has her high-paying job in the city. She doesn't need the crutch of a legacy fund the way a growing business does. The room broke into applause for her bold leadership, while I felt the cold reality of the theft settle into my bones like a winter frost. I didn't move a muscle, my face remaining a mask of professional indifference that I had spent 15 years perfecting in the corridors of Oak Street. I noted the exact sound of the silver fork hitting the porcelain plate at the table next to mine, a sharp, metallic ring that seemed to echo for an eternity. The smell of the lilies on the table became cloying, a scent associated with funerals and the sterile hallways of the hospital I had just escaped. I realized that my mother wasn't just taking the money, she was erasing the last piece of my father's intent, replacing it with a monument to Serena's vanity. Today, I know that this was the moment the internal architecture of my loyalty finally collapsed, leaving behind a clear, unobstructed view of the battlefield. The woman who had birthed me was now just a business adversary who had made a catastrophic error in her risk assessment. As the guests began to stand and mingle for the coffee service, I felt a strange, chilling clarity wash over me, a sensation of being untethered from the expectations of the past. I didn't seek out Eleanor for a confrontation, nor did I look at Serena with the resentment they both expected me to harbor. I simply adjusted my watch, noting the time was exactly 10:22 p.m., and began to map out the logistical requirements for the next 72 hours. The suffocation had ended, replaced by the cold, efficient vacuum of a strategy. I was no longer a daughter waiting for a sign of love. I was a creditor preparing to call in a debt that had been accumulating for 3 decades. What no one in that room understood, as they toasted to Serena's bright future, was that the foundations of their comfort were built on a trust they no longer controlled. I was the architect of their luxury, and I had just decided to move the walls. I walked toward the exit without a word, my footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs that lined the hallway of the estate. I didn't look back at the portraits of the family that had never existed, nor did I stop to say goodbye to the mother who had seen my near death as a performance. As I stepped out into the biting October air, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth greeted me, a reminder of the rural Iowa fields where Grandma Rose was currently waiting. I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. Knowing that the manila envelope she had brought to my hospital bed was the final, unanswerable move in a game Eleanor didn't even know she was playing. The Greyhound bus would be arriving in the city in less than 6 hours, and with it, a truth that would strip the gold leaf from the walls of Oak Street. The last episode of my life as a victim had ended. The audit was about to begin. The morning of October 13th, 2025, arrived with a sterile, uncompromising light that exposed every lingering crumb and wine stain on the Oak Street estate's mahogany surfaces. At 9:14 a.m., the library smelled of freshly pressed Italian linen, expensive dark roast espresso, and the chemical sharpness of high-end toner from the multi-page investment contracts spread across the table. Eleanor sat at the head, her posture a clinical study in victory. Flanked by 3 venture capitalists who represented the vibrant future she had promised to fund with my liquidated stability account. Serena sat beside her, already scrolling through Parisian real estate listings on her iPad, her movements fluid with the unearned confidence of a secondary beneficiary. The air was thick with the silent, mutual congratulations of people who believed that wealth was a direct reflection of moral superiority. They were waiting for the final signatures to cement the theft of my father's legacy, unaware that the room's very atmosphere was about to undergo a violent structural decompression. The door opened at 9:22 a.m., not with a dramatic flourish, but with the steady, heavy weight of Grandma Rose's practical leather shoes striking the hardwood floor. She looked remarkably out of place in her faded quilted jacket and sensible Davenport thrift store trousers. Yet she carried an aura of immovable geological force that froze the room's synthetic chatter. I walked behind her, my charcoal suit still crisp, my hand resting on the small of my back where the surgical incision reminded me of the 3 days Eleanor had spent in a Lake Geneva mud bath. Rose didn't look at the catered breakfast or the expensive art. She looked directly at Eleanor with the sharp, blue eyes of a woman who had spent 78 years auditing the souls of the arrogant. She placed the weathered manila envelope on the center of the mahogany table, right atop the investment contracts, its dull surface a jarring contrast to the polished surroundings. Eleanor didn't stand. She simply adjusted her watch and sighed, a sound that carried the practiced, weary patience of a queen dealing with a peasant insurrection. Rose, this is a private business signing, and while I appreciate the sentiment of your long bus ride, your interference in Chloe's financial independence is no longer required, she remarked, her voice a polished blade of condescension. Rose didn't flinch. She reached into the envelope and pulled out a single, notarized document dated August 14th, 2016. The very day Eleanor had redirected my tuition to Serena's Parisian Arts Intensive. It wasn't a letter of protest, but a structural lien on the Oak Street estate and its associated holding companies, triggered by the unauthorized liquidation of the primary stability fund Eleanor had just announced. The room went silent, the only sound being the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the exact moment Eleanor's internal logic began to encounter a fatal error. I stepped forward then, my voice carrying the clinical, low-frequency resonance of a woman who had spent years designing the very world Eleanor thought she owned. The Ether Initiative, the global branding you've used as collateral for Serena's expansion, isn't a public domain asset you found in Lake Geneva, I stated, the words falling like cold, measured stones into the center of the table. I laid my senior lead designer credentials beside Rose's lien, followed by the intellectual property registration for the Serene Waters Wellness Visual Identity, which I had filed in my own name 3 years prior. Eleanor's face didn't crumble. It tightened, her eyes flicking between the documents as she tried to find a loophole in a reality that was now closing around her. She had been pitching a brand built on my intellectual labor, using my father's money as a deposit, without realizing that the foundation was a debt she could never hope to settle. The venture capitalists shifted in their seats, the smell of their expensive cologne suddenly mixing with the sharp, acidic scent of a deal going sour in real time. The lead investor, a man named Marcus who had toasted Eleanor's visionary leadership the night before, picked up the IP registration and looked at Eleanor with a look of profound professional disgust. Eleanor, you represented this lifestyle brand as a fully owned family asset with clear title and 0 encumbrances, he noted, his voice as cold and detached as a forensic accountant's report. The structural failure was now visible in the way Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her Sancerre, her logical internal narrative failing to provide a defense for a documented fraud. She had spent 30 years treating me as a low-risk, invisible bond, never imagining that the invisible bond had been quietly acquiring the very air she breathed to maintain her social status. Serena's vibrant future dissolved in a matter of seconds, her Parisian dreams replaced by the cold reality of a legal injunction that would freeze every account she planned to use for her luxury expansion. She looked at me, her mouth opening to deliver another practiced barb about my isolation. But the words died as she saw the reflection of her own obsolescence in the documents. The witnesses were no longer an audience for Eleanor's performance. They were creditors observing a catastrophic default of character and capital that would be discussed in the city's boardrooms for the next decade. Eleanor looked at Rose, her eyes searching for a trace of the rural Iowa kindness she had always patronized, but she found only the clinical, unblinking justice of a woman who had waited years for the truth to be the only thing left standing. The Oak Street Museum was finally closing, and the curator was being asked to vacate the premises before the locks were changed. I didn't wait for a rebuttal, nor did I stay to witness the inevitable, messy collapse of the legal arguments Eleanor's lawyers would fruitlessly attempt to assemble over the next few hours. I looked at my mother one last time, noting the exact way the morning light exposed the fine lines of panic beneath her $300 foundation, a detail I had once found intimidating, but now saw as merely a data point. I didn't come here to ask for the money back, and Eleanor, I came to show you that the self-sufficiency you praised was the very thing that allowed me to buy the house you're sitting in, I said, my voice as flat and final as a closing door. I walked out with Rose, my posture erect, my footsteps a rhythmic, steady count on the marble floors that no longer felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked into the crisp October air, leaving the sandalwood-scented ruin behind. The moving trucks arrived at the Oak Street estate on October 15, 2025, precisely at 8:00 their hydraulic lifts creating a rhythmic, industrial hiss that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I watched from the sidewalk, my hands tucked into the pockets of my charcoal trench coat, noting the way the early morning frost clung to the wrought iron gates I no longer intended to open. The movers were efficient, handling the mahogany desks and the silk-upholstered chairs with a professional indifference that stripped the objects of their carefully curated status. Inside, the house smelled of empty spaces and the lingering, stale scent of the white lilies from the gala that had finally begun to wilt. Eleanor stood in the foyer, her silhouette framed by the arched doorway, watching as the physical evidence of her authority was boxed and labeled for storage. She didn't speak, her silence a heavy, pressurized vacuum that seemed to draw the warmth from the hallway, leaving only the cold reality of a structural transition. By the end of the first week, the social architecture of Eleanor's world had begun to show visible fissures, manifesting as unreturned phone calls and canceled luncheon invitations. At 12:30 p.m. on Tuesday, she sat in the sunroom, her iPad displaying a sequence of red receipts from women she had considered her closest allies for over 2 decades. The air was heavy with the scent of neglected ferns and the sharp metallic tang of the silver service that hadn't been polished since the library confrontation. She had attempted to frame the legal injunction as a minor administrative misunderstanding, a clerical error involving her late husband's estate, but the metadata of the truth had already permeated the local country club circuit. People who once vied for her approval now spoke of her in the past tense, their voices hushed and clinical as they analyzed her decline over chilled glasses of Chardonnay. She was becoming a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the very social circles she had once governed. The internal audit of Serena's lifestyle brand, Vibrant Serenity, commenced on November 4, 2025, conducted by a team of 3 forensic accountants I hired from a firm in the Loop. The air in their sterile, glass-walled office smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint, bitter scent of over-extracted espresso as they went through the digital ledgers. They discovered 84 distinct discrepancies where family stability funds had been commingled with personal travel expenses, including a $6,000 charge for a private villa that Eleanor had authorized as R&D. Every receipt was a document of the theft I had sensed but never quantified, a physical paper trail of the years I spent skipping meals while Serena was being culturally immersed in Parisian boutiques. Serena attempted to claim the records were artistically interpreted, a logical defense in her mind that held no structural integrity under the unblinking gaze of the tax authorities. The bill for the back taxes was exactly $212,000. Eleanor's legal team attempted to file a countersuit on November 12th, arguing that Grandma Rose's trust was established under duress or through undue influence of my late father's deteriorating mental state. I received the notification at 10:14 a.m. while sitting in my West Loop loft, the sun hitting my glass desk at the exact angle that highlighted the fine dust on my keyboard. I didn't feel the surge of panic she expected. Instead, I felt a clinical sense of pity for the predictability of her strategy. My lawyers, funded by the very dividends Eleanor had tried to liquidate, responded with a 300-page deposition that included my father's videotaped testimony from 2014. In the video, he spoke with a clarity that cut through Eleanor's narrative like a laser, detailing exactly why he had entrusted Rose with the oversight of my inheritance. He had seen the merchant in Eleanor long before I did, and his foresight was the final, unmovable pillar that crushed her last remaining legal hope. Reputational collapse followed the financial audit with a devastating geometric progression that Eleanor was completely unequipped to handle. The Ether Initiative rebranding, which she had bragged about at every cocktail party, was publicly credited to me in a feature article in the Chicago Design Review on December 1st. The headline, "The Invisible Architect, Chloe's Silent Rise," was shared 3,000 times in the first 24 hours, effectively stripping Eleanor of her self-appointed role as my mentor. The industry now knew that the elegance she draped herself in was my intellectual property, not her inherent taste. She was seen at a local bistro on December 5th, sitting alone at a table near the kitchen, the very position she had assigned me for 15 years. The irony was a cold, tasteless meal that she forced herself to swallow while the surrounding tables avoided eye contact. She was no longer the curator of excellence. She was a debtor in a charcoal-colored world of her own making. Serena's reaction to the collapse was characterized by a frantic, high-decibel denial that manifested in a series of social media posts defending her integrity and vision. At 2 a.m. on December 10th, she sent me a 3,000-word email that smelled of desperation and expensive gin, accusing me of betraying the family bond. For a handful of spreadsheets, she argued that her success would have eventually lifted us all, a logical fallacy that presumed her vanity was a tide that raised all boats. I read the email with the detached curiosity of a lab technician examining a failing culture in a petri dish. I didn't respond to her accusations or her pleas for a temporary bridge loan of $50,000. I simply moved the email to a folder labeled Correspondence, S. Reynolds, and adjusted the settings on my firewall. She was drowning in a sea of her own making, and I had finally realized that I was not a lifeguard. By mid-January, the extended family began to reposition themselves around the new center of gravity, their emails shifting from polite indifference to a sudden, heavy concern for my well-being. Aunt Judith, who hadn't called me since my graduation, reached out on January 15th to suggest a healing brunch at the Four Seasons, her voice vibrating with a newfound respect. She spoke of the misunderstandings between Eleanor and me, as if they were a collective tragedy we all needed to move past for the sake of the family name. The air in the conversation was thick with the scent of opportunistic guilt and the unspoken desire to remain within the orbit of the Serene Waters wellness dividends. I listened to her carefully constructed platitudes, noting the 3 times she mentioned her son's upcoming tuition requirements. She wasn't seeking a reconciliation. She was seeking a seat at the new table I had built with my own hands. I responded to Aunt Judith's invitation on January 17th with a brief, typed letter that outlined my conditions for any future family interaction. I stated that all communication would be handled through my legal counsel and that I would not be attending any healing brunches until a full, public retraction of the iDramatics narrative was issued. I didn't write with anger. I wrote with the clinical precision of a contractor defining the terms of a structural repair. I required a line-item accounting of every dollar taken from my father's stability fund, including interest adjusted for inflation, before I would even consider a phone call. The family's response was a deafening, shocked silence that lasted for exactly 3 weeks. They had expected me to be softened by the victory, to be eager for the validation they were now willing to perform. They didn't understand that I had outgrown the need for their approval during the 4 days I spent alone in a hospital bed. Eleanor finally reached out on February 5th, a day characterized by a relentless gray sleet that turned the Chicago streets into a slurry of ice and salt. She didn't call. She sent a handwritten note on her remaining embossed stationery, the ink slightly blurred as if she had been interrupted while writing. She asked for a private meeting at a quiet cafe in Lincoln Park, one that didn't serve the social elite she had once frequented. The note smelled of the Lake Geneva lavender she still used, a scent that now triggered a memory of her reflection in the hospital television. She wrote about her regrets and her misplaced priorities, using words that felt like they had been rehearsed in front of a mirror until the edges were smoothed away. It was a performance of humility, a tactical retreat designed to elicit the compassion she had never extended to me during my own medical crisis. I kept the note in its envelope, The meeting at the cafe took place on February 12th at 4:15 p.m. The exact time Eleanor had arrived at my hospital room 4 months prior. She looked older, the fine lines around her eyes no longer masked by the expensive treatments she could no longer afford on a weekly basis. She wore a simple wool coat and no jewelry, a visual performance of contrition that was almost convincing in its austerity. We sat at a small wooden table that smelled of stale cinnamon and cheap floor cleaner, a stark contrast to the sandalwood-scented halls of Oak Street. She didn't look at me directly. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap in a gesture of uncharacteristic stillness. "I suppose you're satisfied now, Chloe," she said, her voice carrying a trace of the old glass-like polish that was now cracked and dull. I didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to settle between us like a physical weight. I watched the steam rise from my black coffee, noting the way the overhead fluorescent light created a flickering halo on the surface of the liquid. "Satisfaction isn't the metric I'm using, Eleanor," I replied, my voice as calm and clinical as a surgeon's report. I laid out the reality of the situation. The Oak Street estate was being converted into a residential arts foundation, and she would have 30 days to move her personal effects into a 2-bedroom apartment I had secured. I informed her that the dividends from the Serene Waters Wellness brand would be redirected into a trust for Grandma Rose's medical care and a scholarship fund for design students from rural Iowa. She looked up then, her eyes flashing with a momentary, familiar spark of indignation at the loss of her financial leverage. She had come to negotiate for a return to the status quo, unaware that the status quo had been demolished weeks ago. Looking back at those months, I realized that many of you watching this might recognize the specific, hollow sound of a family member's voice when they realize their leverage is gone. Perhaps you've been the one invisible at the table, the one whose pain was labeled a distraction, while someone else's vanity was funded with your future. It is a unique kind of isolation, one that leaves a permanent mark on the way you view the concept of loyalty and the value of your own silence. I want to ask you, in the comments below, to share the moment you realized that your self-sufficiency wasn't a character flaw, but the very weapon you needed to survive. How did you feel when you finally stopped performing for an audience that refused to see you? Sharing these stories isn't just about venting, it's about mapping the architecture of our own resilience. But before you answer that, you need to understand exactly what happened when Serena tried to call. Serena called from the O'Hare Airport on February 20th, her voice a jagged edge of panic and unearned entitlement that vibrated through my noise-canceling headphones. She had been barred from her flight to Paris because the credit card associated with her business account had been flagged for the ongoing tax audit. She demanded that I fix this immediately, as if I were still the administrative assistant she had treated me as for a decade. The background noise of the terminal, the announcements, the luggage wheels, the distant chatter, created a chaotic soundscape that matched her internal state. I didn't raise my voice or offer a rebuttal to her frantic accusations of financial abuse. I simply reminded her that the account was frozen by a federal agency, not by my personal whim, and that her vibrant future was now a matter for the legal system to resolve. I hung up the phone and returned to my work, the silence of my loft a profound and earned luxury. The transition of the Oak Street estate was finalized on March 15th, a day of bright, unapologetic sunshine that exposed every flaw in the Grand Colonial's facade. I stood in the empty library, the smell of dust and old paper, the only things remaining of the museum Eleanor had built to her own vanity. The mahogany desk was gone, replaced by a row of modern workstations that would soon be occupied by young designers who didn't have to fight for a seat at the table. I felt a strange structural lightness in my chest, a sensation of being finally untethered from the weight of the furniture and the expectations it represented. I moved through the rooms with a sense of clinical closure, noting the exact spots where I had once stood as a ghost, now realizing that the house had always been just wood and stone. The power wasn't in the architecture, it was in the person who decided how the space was used. Grandma Rose arrived from Davenport on March 20th, her presence a grounding, earthy force that made the high-tech renovations of the estate feel suddenly human. She didn't comment on the price of the furniture or the prestige of the foundation. She simply walked into the kitchen and began to organize the new pantry with the same disciplined focus she used for her Iowa garden. We sat in the breakfast nook, drinking tea that smelled of peppermint and wood smoke, the silence between us a comfortable shared understanding of the victory we had achieved. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her grip as firm and knowing as the day she pressed the $5 bill into my palm. "The tools are sharp now, Chloe," she whispered, her eyes shining with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen the audit through to its conclusion. She was the hidden architect of my survival, the one who had seen the merchant in Eleanor and prepared the counter-move. The rebranding of Serene Waters Wellness was officially launched on April 1st, with a gala that was the polar opposite of Eleanor's birthday celebration. There were no fog machines, no imported truffles, and no choreographed social hierarchy. Instead, there was a focus on radical transparency, a value I had integrated into every pixel of the brand's new identity. The event was held at the retreat in Lake Geneva, the air smelling of fresh cedar and the crisp, clean water of the lake. I stood on the deck, watching the sunset hit the water at a 45-degree angle, and realized that I was no longer an anonymous designer buried in the metadata. My name was on the board of directors, and my vision was the structural foundation of the property's success. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to lead, and the difference was a physical sensation of power that radiated from my core. Eleanor attended the opening, not as a guest of honor, but as a minority stakeholder with no voting rights, a position that required her to sit in the general audience. She wore a simple navy dress and stayed near the periphery of the room, her movements hesitant and devoid of the social radiance she had once projected. She watched as I took the stage to announce the foundation's first round of scholarships, her face a mask of unreadable emotions that I no longer felt the need to interpret. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't look for her approval or her judgment in the crowd. I spoke to the audience with a clarity that came from knowing my own worth was independent of her gaze. She was a guest in a world I had built, a temporary occupant of a narrative that was no longer hers to control. The transformation was complete, and the evidence was in the silence of her response. Serena did not attend the opening, as she was currently occupied with a series of depositions regarding the commingling of funds and the misrepresentation of her business assets. She had moved into a small apartment in a less prestigious neighborhood, her vibrant brand now reduced to a series of legal filings and a mountain of unsold inventory. I received a brief report from my legal team on April 10th, noting that she had taken a job as a junior sales associate at a high-end boutique she used to frequent as a customer. The irony was a clinical data point that I recorded without satisfaction or malice. She was learning the value of $1 from the other side of the counter, a lesson that I had mastered at 18 while she was in Paris. The hierarchy had been inverted, not through a calculated revenge, but through the natural consequences of a lifestyle built on a foundation of unearned capital. By May, the Oak Street Arts Foundation was fully operational, its halls filled with the scent of oil paints, fresh clay, and the hopeful energy of students who finally had a place to belong. I visited once a week, walking through the studios and observing the way the young designers interacted with the space I had redesigned for their benefit. I saw myself in the girl sitting at the far end of the table, her eyes focused on the screen with a fierce, quiet determination that I recognized instantly. I didn't offer her a platitude or a shallow compliment. I sat beside her and asked her about the structural integrity of her design, treating her as a peer rather than a subordinate. I was providing the armory she needed to sharpen her own craft, ensuring that the next generation of architects wouldn't have to build their lives out of the scraps of someone else's dismissal. The transformation wasn't about the money or the estate. It was about the moment I stopped waiting for an apology that would never be anatomically possible for a woman like Eleanor. We often wait for a sorry that acts as a key to our own freedom, not realizing that the lock was already broken from the inside. If you've ever had to build a life out of the scraps of someone else's dismissal, you know that the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop asking for permission to exist. I'm curious to know, for those of you who have walked away from a toxic dynamic, what was the singular object or phrase that finally gave you the clarity to leave? Was it a manila envelope, a cold text, or a silence that lasted one day too long? Tell me your story. Because your words might be the bridge someone else needs to cross their own Oak Street. Because what happened next at the Serene Waters reopening changed everything. The final audit of my father's estate was closed on June 15, 2026, marking the end of a legal battle that had lasted exactly 8 months and 4 days. I sat in my lawyer's office, the air smelling of old leather and the faint, ozonic scent of a high-speed scanner, as the final documents were signed and notarized. The total recovery for the Stability Fund was $342,000, a figure that represented the restoration of a legacy that had been nearly erased by Eleanor's vanity. I felt a sense of clinical finality as I watched the signature line dry, the ink a permanent record of a truth that had finally been validated by the system. I wasn't a victim of a budget conflict anymore. I was the administrator of a trust that would ensure Grandma Rose's comfort for the rest of her life. The theft had been corrected, and the balance had been restored to a neutral, structural equilibrium. I drove to Davenport the following weekend, the Iowa landscape a vast, green expanse of cornfields and cedar trees that smelled of the earth and the promise of a quiet life. I found Rose in her garden, her hands covered in the dark, rich soil she had tended for 50 years, her movements slow and deliberate. We didn't talk about the money or the legal victory. We talked about the tomatoes and the way the weather was finally turning toward summer. She looked at me with a pride that was quiet and uncomplicated, a sharp contrast to the conditional approval I had spent 3 decades chasing on Oak Street. In her eyes, I wasn't a blue-chip stock or a diversified bond. I was just her granddaughter, the one who had survived the storm and returned with the tools to build something better. We sat on her porch as the sun went down, the silence between us a living, breathing testament to a bond that Eleanor could never understand. Eleanor's final move was a request for a monthly allowance from the Serene Waters dividends, a plea she framed as a necessary support for a woman of her standing in a letter sent on July 1st. I responded on July 3rd with a calculated counteroffer. I would provide for her basic housing and medical needs, provided she attended a series of financial literacy courses and stopped all public use of the family name for her social maneuvering. I wasn't punishing her. I was establishing a structural boundary that prevented her from ever again using my resources to fund a performance of excellence. She accepted the terms within 48 hours, her signature a shaky, defeated scrawl on the bottom of the agreement. She was finally living within the reality she had created for me, a life of self-sufficiency that was no longer a choice, but a requirement. The merchant had finally run out of things to sell. The summer of 2026 was a plateau of reflection, a period of 14 weeks where the noise of the conflict finally faded into a distant, manageable hum. I spent my mornings in the loft, the smell of fresh coffee, and the quiet clicking of my keyboard, the only sounds in the room as I worked on new projects for clients who valued my name. I no longer felt the need to check Eleanor's digital footprint or monitor Serena's social media posts for traces of their resentment. Their lives were data points in a closed case, a set of variables that no longer affected the outcome of my own internal architecture. I was living in a world of my own design, where the air was filtered and the light was honest. And for the first time in my life, I felt the structural integrity of my own happiness. The ghost of Oak Street had been exorcised, replaced by the solid, unyielding reality of a woman who had finally become her own architect. I visited the Serene Waters Wellness Retreat on August 14, 2026, exactly 10 years after the day Eleanor had redirected my tuition to Serena's Parisian Arts Intensive. I stood on the same deck where I had once been an invisible observer, watching the guests move through the muted sage and brushed gold environment I had created. The air smelled of cedar and the faint, sweet scent of the herbal tea I had commissioned, a sensory reminder of the victory I had achieved through my own intellectual labor. I sat in one of the chairs I had designed, noting the exact angle of the lumbar support and the way the fabric felt against my skin. I wasn't a guest or a daughter waiting for a sign. I was the owner, and the silence of the retreat was a reflection of the peace I had finally found within myself. The cycle was closed, and the foundation was secure. The cousins who had once ignored me now sent invitations to their weddings and graduation parties, their tone a choreographed performance of family unity that I found increasingly transparent. I attended a wedding in late August, wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than Eleanor's remaining savings, and noted the way the room shifted as I entered. They didn't see the dramatic daughter anymore. They saw the woman who held the keys to the family legacy and the intellectual property of its most successful brand. I moved through the room with a measured, clinical grace, accepting their compliments with a polite indifference that I knew was more unsettling than anger. I didn't seek out their approval, nor did I offer them a seat at my table. I simply observed their repositioning with the detached curiosity of a social scientist. They were part of a world I had outgrown, a set of characters in a play that had already reached its final curtain. Serena's lifestyle brand was officially liquidated on September 1st. The remaining inventory sold off to a discount retailer for exactly 8 cents on the dollar. I received a final notification from the bankruptcy court, a document that smelled of stale ink and the cold finality of a failed enterprise. I thought about the $12,000 Eleanor had taken from me to fund Serena's cultural immersion and realized that the return on that investment had been a complete and utter zero. Serena had spent her life performing for an audience that didn't exist, while I had spent mine building a foundation that couldn't be shaken. The difference was now visible in the way we lived our lives. One of us working behind a counter in a neighborhood she hated, and the other designing the future from a glass loft in the city. The logic of the merchant had failed, and the logic of the architect had prevailed. By October, the Oak Street estate had become a vibrant hub of creativity, the once silent halls now echoing with the sounds of collaboration and the scent of fresh innovation. I walked through the gardens on a crisp afternoon, noting the way the fall colors were beginning to emerge in a palette of deep oranges and muted reds. I sat on a stone bench that had once been Eleanor's favorite spot for meditation, and realized that I felt no resentment for the years I had spent in her shadow. The shadows were where I had learned to see the world with precision, where I had built the weapons I needed to claim the light. I was no longer defined by the trauma of my past. I was defined by the structural integrity of the life I had built out of its ruins. I stood up and walked toward the house, my footsteps a steady, confident beat on the gravel path. Eleanor moved into her new apartment on October 15th, exactly 1 year after the moving trucks had first arrived at Oak Street. It was a clean 2-bedroom unit in a quiet part of the city, with a view of a small park and a kitchen that smelled of nothing but fresh paint. I visited her once to drop off the final keys, noting the way she had arranged her remaining photographs on a small shelf in the living room. She didn't have the silk wraps or the sandalwood scent anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally been forced to confront the unpolished reality of her own choices. We didn't talk about the past or the trust or the legal battle. We talked about the weather and the local grocery store. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, a dialogue between two people who were no longer playing roles in a family drama. She was a mother who had failed, and I was a daughter who had survived. Grandma Rose passed away peacefully in her sleep on November 12, 2026, her life ending with the same quiet, disciplined grace she had maintained for 78 years. I buried her in the Iowa soil she loved, in a small cemetery that smelled of cedar and the coming winter frost. The service was small, attended only by those who truly knew the weight of her character and the depth of her wisdom. I stood by her grave, holding a single white lily, and realized that her legacy wasn't the money or the estate. It was the clarity she had given me to see the truth when I was surrounded by lies. She had been the secret ally who saw the architecture of my pain and provided the blueprint for my escape. I left the cemetery with a sense of clinical gratitude, knowing that her work was finished and her investment had been returned 1,000 times over. The plateau of reflection had finally reached its end, and I stood at the edge of a new year with a sense of purpose that was no longer fueled by the need for justice or revenge. I looked out over the Chicago skyline at 7:14 a.m. on January 1st, 2027, the city a cold, beautiful landscape of glass and steel that I had helped to define. The air was crisp and filtered, and the sun was hitting the windows of my loft with a clinical, unblinking brilliance that signaled the start of a new chapter. I wasn't the girl from Oak Street anymore, and I wasn't the patient in the hospital bed. I was the architect of my own destiny, and the foundation was unbreakable. I adjusted my watch, noting the time with a precision that had become my second nature, and began to map out the logistical requirements for the next phase of my life. The audit was over, and the future was mine to design. Today is Tuesday, March 30th, 2026, and the morning light in my West Loop loft hits the polished concrete floor at a precise 7:14 a.m., creating a geometric pattern that I find deeply grounding. I sit at my solid walnut desk, which smells faintly of linseed oil and the expensive, earthy roast of the coffee I grind myself at 6:30 a.m. There is a singular ceramic mug on my desk, a piece I commissioned from a local artist, its texture rough and honest against my palm, a stark contrast to the fragile baccarat crystal of my childhood. I no longer check my phone for missed calls from Lake Geneva, nor do I feel the phantom vibration of a clinical text message telling me to check with the nursing staff. My surgical scar is now a thin, silver line, a physical data point marking the coordinate where my old life ended and my autonomy began. The air here is clean, devoid of sandalwood or performance. I visited the Oak Street Arts Foundation yesterday to sign off on the final budget for the summer residency program, noting how the once stifling library now smells of fresh turpentine and the hopeful energy of 22 scholarship students. Eleanor's old mahogany desk has been replaced by a modular drafting table where a girl from a small town in Nebraska was working on a branding project for a rural co-op. I watched her for a moment, her focus so absolute that she didn't notice me standing in the doorway, and I felt a sense of structural completion that no bank balance could ever provide. My mother lives in the 2-bedroom apartment I secured for her, her social calendar now reduced to community garden meetings and a weekly bridge game with women who don't know her former status. We don't speak of the trust or the hospital. We speak of the weather. Our conversations as functional as the linoleum floors she now walks upon. For those of you watching this, you might be looking for a grand apology or a moment of cinematic weeping from the person who discarded you when you were at your most vulnerable. I am here to tell you that the apology is a decorative element, not a load-bearing wall, and waiting for it is a waste of your precious structural integrity. justice isn't found in their admission of guilt. It is found in the moment you realize their opinion of you has exactly zero market value in the life you have built. I am not the strong one, because I endured their neglect. I am the architect, because I took the stones they threw at me and used them to pave my own way out of the shadow. Survival is a clinical process of removing the toxic debt of their expectations until the only thing left standing is your own unvarnished truth. You are finally, irrevocably visible to yourself. The manila envelope that Grandma Rose brought into that hospital room on the 4th day wasn't just a legal trust. It was a map to a territory Eleanor could never hope to occupy. It was the evidence that I was loved in silence by someone who understood the value of a sharp tool and a quiet plan long before I ever did. Today, the only soup I eat is the kind I make myself, the steam rising from the pot in a kitchen that is entirely mine, governed by my own rules and schedule. The silence in my home is no longer a vacuum. It is a solid, shimmering presence of peace that I earned with every silent hour I spent working on Whacker Drive. I want to leave you with one final question to consider as you reflect on your own journey toward the light. If you could send a 5-word message to the person you were on your darkest day, what would it be?